The stallion's hooves thundered across the parched earth, as Victoria Russo clutched desperately to the saddle horn, her tears mingling with the dust of the unforgiving New Mexico territory. The year was 1878, and she was running from the whispers, the pointed fingers, and the cruel laughter that had followed her out of Santa Fe like a pack of hungry wolves. Victoria guided her horse around a cluster of sagebrush, her body aching from 2 days of hard riding. She'd left with nothing but a small bundle of clothes, the few dollars she'd saved from her seamstress work, and the crushing weight of shame. At 22, she was unmarried, unwanted, and carrying a child whose father had disappeared on the eastbound train 3 months ago with promises to return that had proven as empty as the desert sky. The sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold. Victoria knew she needed to find shelter before nightfall. Coyotes weren't the only predators that stalked these lands after dark. In the distance, a thin plume of smoke rose against the darkening sky. A homestead, perhaps, or a ranch. Victoria hesitated. The thought of facing strangers made her stomach clench, but she had little choice. Her water skin was nearly empty, and her provisions wouldn't last another day. With a gentle nudge, she directed her tired horse toward the promise of civilization. As she drew closer, she could make out a modest ranch house with a barn and corral. A few cattle grazed in the distance, and the soft glow of lamplight spilled from the windows. Victoria dismounted carefully, her hand instinctively moving to her abdomen. The small swell was barely noticeable beneath her travel-worn dress, but to her, it felt like a brand, a visible mark of her shame. She tied her horse to the hitching post and approached the door with faltering steps. Before she could knock, it swung open, revealing a tall man silhouetted against the warm light behind him. "Evening, madam," he said, his voice deep and rough like gravel. "Saw you riding in. You look like you could use some rest." Victoria tried to find her voice, but exhaustion and fear had stolen it away. The man stepped forward, and she could see him clearly now: weathered skin, broad shoulders, and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He wore simple clothes, a cotton shirt, worn denim pants, and scuffed boots. "No gun belt," she noted with relief. "Name's Wade Lawson," he said, extending a calloused hand. "This here's the Broken Spoke Ranch." "Victoria Russo," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Lawson. I was hoping. That is, I wondered if I might." Wade waited patiently as she struggled to form the words. "I can pay," she finally managed, reaching for the small pouch tied at her waist. "For a place to sleep tonight, and perhaps some water for my horse." A woman appeared beside Wade, wiping her hands on her apron. She was older, with silver streaking her dark hair and deep lines etched around her eyes. "For heaven's sake, Wade, invite the poor girl in before she collapses," the woman chided, stepping forward. "I'm Martha, Wade's aunt. Come in, child. Supper's nearly ready." Victoria hesitated, but her legs trembled with fatigue, making the decision for her. "Thank you," she murmured, following Martha inside while Wade went to tend to her horse. The interior of the ranch house was modest but welcoming. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the air smelled of freshly baked bread and something savory simmering over the fire. Victoria's stomach growled audibly, reminding her that she'd eaten nothing since morning. Martha led her to a chair at the rough-hewn table and placed a cup of steaming coffee before her. "Drink," she instructed. "Then we'll get some food in you." Victoria obeyed, cradling the warm cup between her cold fingers. The bitter liquid revived her somewhat, and she felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. Wade returned, bringing with him the scent of night air and horses. He hung his hat on a peg by the door and washed his hands in a basin before joining them at the table. "Your mare's all settled," he told Victoria. "Fine animal. Looks like she's carried you a fair distance." Victoria nodded. "From Santa Fe." Martha raised her eyebrows as she placed a bowl of stew before their guest. "Santa Fe? That's nearly 3 days' ride." "What brings you so far from civilization, if you don't mind my asking?" Victoria's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She'd known this question would come, yet she had no answer prepared. No answer that wouldn't reveal her shame, at least. I'm seeking work," she said finally. It wasn't entirely a lie. She would need work, and soon, if she was to provide for herself and her child. Wade and Martha exchanged a glance that told Victoria they didn't entirely believe her story, but they asked no further questions as she ate. After the meal, Martha showed Victoria to a small bedroom at the back of the house. "It's not much," the older woman apologized, "but the bed's clean and you'll have privacy." "It's more than generous," Victoria replied, setting her bundle on a chair. "I'm grateful for your kindness to a stranger." Martha's eyes softened. "Rest now. Morning comes early on a ranch." Left alone, Victoria finally allowed herself to collapse onto the bed. Tears came unbidden, hot and painful. She curled around her middle, protecting the life growing there, and wept silently. No respectable man would want her now damaged goods with another man's child. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "You've ruined yourself, Victoria. What decent man will have you now?" Dawn arrived with the crowing of a rooster. Victoria had slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of judgment and abandonment. She rose, splashed water on her face from the basin, and pinned her hair into a simple knot. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a face too pale, with shadows beneath her eyes. She found Martha in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread. The older woman looked up with a smile. "Good morning, child. You look better with some rest in you." "Hungry?" Victoria nodded, moving to help without being asked. Martha directed her to set the table while bacon sizzled in a cast iron pan. Wade entered as they were finishing the preparations, bringing with him the fresh scent of morning air and hay. He nodded a greeting and took a seat at the table. "Sleep well?" he asked Victoria as Martha placed a plate of eggs and bacon before him. "Yes, thank you," she lied, not meeting his eyes. Breakfast passed with talk of ranch matters, cattle that needed moving, a fence that required mending, supplies that were running low. Victoria listened, finding comfort in the ordinary concerns of daily life. "I should be on my way after breakfast," she said when there was a lull in the conversation. "I've imposed enough." "Nonsense," Martha replied firmly. "Where will you go?" Victoria looked down at her plate. "I'm not certain. West, perhaps. I heard there's work in the mining towns." Wade set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Mining towns are no place for a woman alone," he said, his voice grave. "Especially one in your condition." Victoria's head snapped up, her face draining of color. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, though the hand that instinctively moved to her abdomen betrayed her. Martha reached across the table to pat Victoria's arm. "Child, I raised 6 children of my own. I know the signs." Shame burned through Victoria, hot and painful. She pushed back from the table, nearly knocking over her chair in her haste to escape their judgment. "I should go," she choked out, turning toward the door. "Victoria, wait," Wade called, rising to his feet. She paused, her hand on the doorframe, but couldn't bring herself to face him. "We're not judging you," he said softly. "And you don't have to leave. In fact—" he hesitated, then continued more firmly. "We could use help around here. Martha's not as young as she once was, and I've been thinking of hiring someone to help with the cooking and cleaning. The pay wouldn't be much, but you'd have a roof over your head and food on your plate." Victoria turned slowly, searching his face for signs of deceit or ulterior motives. She found none, only steady honesty in his clear blue eyes. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Wade glanced at his aunt, who nodded encouragingly. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said simply. "And like I said, we need the help." Victoria looked between them, these strangers who offered kindness when her own family had turned her away. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time from gratitude rather than despair. "I accept," she whispered. "Thank you." The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Victoria rose with the sun to help Martha prepare breakfast, while Wade tended to the ranch work. The women managed the household tasks, cooking, cleaning, mending, and tending the vegetable garden that supplied much of their food. Victoria discovered that Martha had been the local midwife for many years before arthritis had slowed her down. The older woman seemed to sense Victoria's fear about her approaching confinement and began sharing her knowledge, teaching Victoria about herbs and remedies, the signs of labor, and how to care for a newborn. "Every woman fears the first time," Martha told her one afternoon as they shelled peas on the porch. "But women have been birthing babies since the beginning of time. Your body knows what to do." Victoria nodded, though her fear went beyond the physical aspects of childbirth. "What will I do after?" she asked quietly. "A woman alone with a child." Martha's weathered hand stilled. "You're not alone, child, not anymore." Victoria blinked back tears. It was true that both Martha and Wade had treated her with nothing but kindness. Wade, especially, had been considerate in ways she hadn't expected. He'd fashioned a small wooden step to help her mount her horse when she accompanied Martha to visit a neighboring homestead. He'd built shelves in her room when he noticed her few possessions scattered about. And sometimes, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between concern and admiration. But kindness wasn't the same as acceptance, and temporary shelter wasn't a future. As the weeks passed, Victoria's condition became more pronounced. She sewed new dresses to accommodate her changing body, letting out seams and adding panels where necessary. The child quickened within her, tiny movements that filled her with wonder despite the circumstances of its conception. Wade never mentioned her pregnancy directly, but his actions spoke of awareness and consideration. He brought home a rocking chair from town, claiming Martha had been wanting one for years. He returned from another trip with a small carved wooden horse, which he presented awkwardly, muttering something about having picked it up on a whim. Victoria placed the toy on the small table beside her bed, touching it each night before she slept, wondering about the man who had carved it. Wade Lawson remained something of a mystery to her. He was unfailingly polite, but she knew little of his past beyond what Martha had shared, that he'd fought briefly in the war as a very young man, had worked cattle drives for years afterward, and had returned to take over his uncle's ranch when the older man died 3 years ago. One evening, as Victoria sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold, Wade joined her. He sat in the chair beside hers, offering a mug of coffee, which she declined with a smile. "The baby doesn't seem to like it," she explained, then blushed at having referenced her condition so directly. Wade nodded, taking a sip from his own mug. They sat in companionable silence as the light faded from the sky, revealing a blanket of stars overhead. "I never tire of this view," Wade said eventually. "Makes a man feel small and significant all at once." Victoria glanced at him, surprised by the philosophical turn of his thoughts. "How so?" He gestured toward the vast expanse above them. "All those stars have been shining for more years than we can count. They'll be there long after we're gone. Makes our troubles seem small." He paused, then added more softly, "But then, each of us is as unique as any star. No two the same." Victoria pondered this, her hand resting on the swell of her abdomen where her child slumbered. "I suppose that's true." Wade cleared his throat. "Victoria, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Her heart quickened, though she couldn't have said why. "Yes." He seemed to struggle with his words, which was unusual for a man typically so direct. "The child's father," he finally said. "Is he? Will he be coming for you?" Victoria's breath caught. She hadn't spoken of Richard to anyone since leaving Santa Fe. The pain of his betrayal was still too fresh. "No," she answered, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "He's gone. He was passing through Santa Fe on business, or so he claimed. He spoke of marriage, of taking me back east with him." She laughed bitterly. "I believed him. When I told him about the baby, he said he needed time to arrange things. The next day, he was gone." Wade's hands tightened around his mug. "The man's a coward." "Yes," Victoria agreed softly, "but I was a fool." "No," Wade said firmly. "Trusting isn't foolish, breaking trust is." Victoria studied his profile in the dim light. His jaw was set in a hard line, and she realized with a start that he was angry on her behalf. The knowledge warmed something inside her that had been cold for too long. "Thank you," she said, though the words seemed inadequate. Wade nodded once, then stood. "Getting late. We should head in." The exchange marked a shift in their relationship. Wade began sharing more of himself with Victoria, stories of his time on the cattle drives, of the places he'd seen and people he'd met. In turn, she told him of her childhood in Santa Fe, of her father's death when she was 16, and of the years she'd spent supporting herself and her mother with her needlework. "You're very skilled," Wade commented one evening as he watched her mending one of his shirts. "My aunt says your stitches are finer than any she's seen." Victoria smiled, pleased by the compliment. "I always enjoyed it. There's something satisfying about creating order from chaos, mending what's broken." Wade's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary before he looked away. "Yes, there is." As her time grew nearer, Victoria found herself more anxious. She'd received a letter from her mother, her only family, making it clear that she was not welcome to return to Santa Fe with her bastard child. The words had cut deep, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Martha found her weeping over the letter, sitting on her bed with tears streaming down her face. The older woman didn't ask questions, simply sat beside Victoria and held her until the storm passed. "Family isn't always blood," Martha said when Victoria had quieted. "Sometimes it's the people who choose to love you, despite having no obligation to do so." Victoria wiped her eyes. "I don't know what I would have done if you and Wade hadn't taken me in." Martha patted her hand. "God has a way of putting us where we need to be, even when we don't understand the journey." She paused, then added with unusual hesitation, "Wade's a good man, Victoria, the best I know." Victoria looked up, startled by the sudden change in topic. "I know he is." Martha seemed about to say more, but then merely nodded. "Rest now. You need your strength." The baby came early on a crisp October morning, announcing its intention with sharp pains that woke Victoria from a restless sleep. She managed to make her way to Martha's room, clutching the doorframe as another contraction seized her. "It's time," she gasped when Martha's eyes flew open. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Martha proved a calm and capable presence, guiding Victoria through the labor with steady hands and soothing words. Wade had been banished to the barn after bringing water and clean linens, his face pale with concern. As the sun reached its zenith, Victoria gave a final, tremendous push, and her daughter slid into the world with a lusty cry that seemed too powerful for such a tiny being. "A girl," Martha announced, tears in her eyes as she cleaned the infant and placed her in Victoria's trembling arms. Strong and perfect. Victoria gazed down at the red, wrinkled face, the wispy dark hair, the tiny fists waving in indignation at being thrust from her warm sanctuary. Love, fierce and overwhelming, surged through her. Whatever shame had attended this child's conception was burned away in the fire of that love. "Lily," she whispered, touching the petal's soft cheek. "Her name is Lily." Later, after Martha had helped her clean up and change into a fresh nightgown, Wade was allowed to enter. He approached the bed with cautious steps, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in Victoria's arms. "Would you like to meet her?" Victoria asked softly. Wade came closer, peering down at the sleeping infant. His expression of wonder made Victoria's heart swell. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Like her mother, Victoria blushed, uncertain how to respond to the unexpected compliment. "Her name's Lily," she told him. "Lily," he repeated, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. Lily reflexively grasped his finger, and Wade's face transformed with a smile of such tenderness that Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. In the weeks that followed, Victoria discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Caring for a newborn was exhausting, but Lily thrived under her mother's devoted attention. Martha and Wade helped where they could. Martha with her years of experience with infants, Wade with his willingness to walk a fussy baby in the early hours of the morning when Victoria was at the end of her endurance. "You don't have to do this," Victoria told him one night when he appeared at her door, awakened by Lily's cries. "She's not your responsibility." Wade took the crying infant from her arms with practiced ease. "Go back to sleep, Victoria. I've got her." As he turned to leave, Victoria caught his arm. "Why?" she asked, the question that had been on her mind for months finally finding voice. "Why help us?" Wade looked down at Lily, who had already begun to quiet against his broad chest. "Because everyone deserves kindness," he said simply. "And because—" He hesitated, then met Victoria's eyes directly. "Because you both matter to me." Before she could respond, he left, carrying Lily to the main room where he would rock her until she slept again. Victoria stood in the doorway, watching them go, a new awareness dawning. The seasons turned. Winter settled over the land with a blanket of snow that transformed the harsh landscape into something magical. Victoria stood at the window one morning, Lily in her arms, watching Wade chop wood in the yard. The muscles in his back and shoulders flexed with each swing of the axe, and she found herself admiring the strength and grace of his movements. "Your mama's being silly," she whispered to Lily, who gurgled in response, drooling contentedly on Victoria's shoulder. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive atmosphere despite their isolation. Martha insisted on decorations: pine boughs over the mantel, red berries in small dishes, candles in the windows. Victoria sewed a tiny dress for Lily from scraps of red fabric and knitted small stockings for all of them to hang by the fireplace. On Christmas Eve, after Lily had been put to bed, the three adults sat around the fire drinking hot cider. Martha regaled them with stories of Christmases past, of Wade as a boy receiving his first pony, of the year a blizzard had stranded 3 traveling salesmen at the ranch, and they'd all ended up singing carols until dawn. When Martha retired for the night, Wade and Victoria remained by the fire, comfortable in the silence that had become familiar between them. "I have something for you," Wade said eventually, reaching into his pocket. "For Christmas." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Victoria untied it carefully, aware of his eyes on her face. Inside was a silver locket on a delicate chain. "Wade," she breathed, lifting it to catch the firelight. It's beautiful. Open it, he urged. She did, finding it empty inside. For Lily, Wade explained. A lock of her hair, perhaps, or someday a picture. Victoria closed her hand around the locket, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Thank you, I have something for you as well, though it's not nearly as fine. She retrieved a package from beneath the sofa where she'd hidden it. Wade unwrapped it to find a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. I noticed your old one was fraying, she explained, suddenly shy. The color, it matches your eyes. Wade ran his fingers over the even stitches, his expression unreadable. No one's made me anything by hand since my mother died, he said quietly. Thank you, Victoria. He looked up at her then, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. He stood, moving to sit beside her on the sofa, the scarf still clutched in his hands. Victoria, he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. These past months, having you and Lily here, it's changed things. For the better, I hope, she said, trying to keep her tone light despite the sudden hammering of her heart. Yes, he said firmly. For the better, I never thought. He shook his head, starting again. When my uncle died and left me this place, I figured I'd live out my days here alone. Never thought I'd want anything different, but now. Victoria waited, hardly daring to breathe. Now I can't imagine this place without you, he finished. Without both of you. Wade, she whispered, unable to say more. He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. I'm not good with words, Victoria. Never have been. But I want you to know that if you wanted to stay not as my housekeeper, but as... He swallowed hard. If you could see your way to considering me as more than just your employer. Victoria's free hand moved to cover his. I already do, she said softly. The hope that blazed in his eyes nearly undid her. You do, she nodded, suddenly certain. I've come to care for you deeply, Wade, but I never thought you could want someone like me, his brow furrowed. Someone like you used, she said bluntly. Damaged. With another man's child. Wade's expression darkened. Is that what you think? That I would see you that way? Victoria looked down. It's how most men would see me. I'm not most men, Wade said, his voice low and intense. He lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. You are the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and Lily, she's a blessing, not a burden. Tears filled Victoria's eyes at his words. You truly believe that, with all my heart. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it made her heart ache. She responded with a sigh, her hand moving to his cheek, feeling the roughness of his evening stubble beneath her palm. When they parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Victoria Russo. You and Lily both. I want to be a family, a real family, if you'll have me. Victoria closed her eyes, savoring the words she'd never expected to hear again. I love you too, she whispered. And yes, I'll have you. The new year brought changes to the Broken Spoke Ranch. Wade formally proposed on New Year's Day, presenting Victoria with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. They were married 2 weeks later by a traveling preacher, with Martha and Lily as their only witnesses. Wade began construction on an addition to the house, 2 new rooms to give them more space as their family grew. Victoria planted flower seeds along the walkway, determined to bring beauty to their practical surroundings. In the spring, Wade filed papers to legally adopt Lily, who at 6 months old was sitting up, babbling constantly, and regarding the world with curious brown eyes that showed no trace of her biological father. She's a Lawson now, Wade said proudly when the papers were finalized. Just like her mother. Victoria leaned against him, watching as Lily attempted to crawl across the porch, determined to reach the colorful ball Wade had carved for her. "I never dreamed I could be this happy again," she admitted. "After Richard, I thought—" Wade's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Don't give him another thought. He didn't deserve either of you." Victoria tilted her face up to his. "I thank God every day that I found my way here to you." "So do I," Wade murmured, bending to kiss her softly. Life settled into new patterns. Victoria continued to help Martha with household duties. But now she also assisted with the ranch accounts, discovering a head for figures that Wade readily admitted exceeded his own. They hired a young man to help with the heavier ranch work, allowing Wade to spend more time with his growing family. Lily's first birthday arrived with celebration. Martha baked a small cake, and Wade presented his daughter with a rocking horse he'd spent months crafting in secret. Victoria watched her husband and daughter together, her heart full to bursting as Lily squealed with delight at the gift, reaching for Wade with complete trust and adoration. Later that night, after Lily had been put to bed, Victoria found Wade on the porch, gazing up at the stars as he often did when deep in thought. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. He turned in her embrace, gathering her close. "I was just thinking how different my life is from what I imagined a year ago. Better, so much better." Victoria rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Mine too." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Any regrets? About staying here, I mean?" "It's a hard life and a lonely one sometimes." Victoria looked up at him, surprised by the question. "None," she said firmly. "I have everything I need right here." Wade's eyes softened as he gazed down at her. "So do I." He led her inside to their bedroom, closing the door quietly behind them. In the privacy of their room, he pulled her close, his kisses growing more urgent as his hands moved over her body with familiar intimacy. Later, as they lay tangled together in the aftermath of their lovemaking, Victoria traced idle patterns on Wade's chest. "I have something to tell you," she said, suddenly nervous. Wade caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "What is it, love?" Victoria took a deep breath. "I'm with child again. Your child." Wade went completely still, then sat up, looking down at her with an expression of wonder. "Are you certain?" She nodded, a smile spreading across her face at his reaction. "Martha confirmed it yesterday. The baby should arrive in late autumn." Wade gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious porcelain. "Victoria," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You've made me the happiest man alive." His hand moved to her still flat abdomen, spreading wide as if to protect the tiny life just beginning there. "Our child," he marveled. Victoria covered his hand with her own. "Our child," she agreed. "Lily will be a wonderful big sister." Wade chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her ear. "She'll run the poor baby ragged, I expect. She's got a determined spirit, that one." "Like her father," Victoria teased. "And her mother," Wade countered, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They lay together in contented silence, planning and dreaming as the moon traveled across the night sky outside their window. The months passed in a blend of daily work and quiet joy. Victoria's body changed with her advancing pregnancy, and Wade watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and concern. He insisted she rest more, taking on additional household tasks himself, and hiring a local girl to help with the heavier cleaning. Lily, now walking and beginning to form words, approached her mother's expanding waistline with curiosity. "Baby," she would say, patting Victoria's belly with her small hands. "Baby come soon." "Not yet, sweetheart," Victoria would reply, smoothing her daughter's dark curls. "The baby needs to grow a bit more first." As summer gave way to autumn, Victoria found herself reflecting on the dramatic changes in her life over the past year. From desperate flight to profound happiness, from shame to pride, from loneliness to being surrounded by love. The journey seemed almost miraculous in retrospect. One evening, as the first hints of cooler weather touched the air, Victoria sat on the porch swing that Wade had built during the summer. Her hands rested on her swollen abdomen, feeling the strong movements of the child within. 8 months along now, she was counting the days until she could hold this new life in her arms. Wade found her there, returning from checking on a pregnant mare in the barn. He sat beside her, placing his arm around her shoulders and drawing her close. "How are my girls?" he asked, his hand joining hers on her belly. "Your son," Victoria corrected with a smile, "is practicing his kicking again." Wade raised an eyebrow. "So sure it's a boy this time," Victoria nodded. "Martha says she can tell by how I'm carrying, and I think she's right. This pregnancy feels different from Lily's. Boy or girl, doesn't matter to me," Wade said, kissing her temple, "as long as you're both healthy." They sat together, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. From inside the house came the sound of Lily's laughter as Martha entertained her with a game of peek-a-boo. "I never thought I could be this happy," Victoria admitted softly. "After everything, I thought no decent man would ever want me. That first night on the trail, I remember weeping because I believed my life was over, that I'd always be alone." Wade turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "Victoria, the day you rode onto this ranch was the luckiest day of my life. You and Lily. You gave me a family when I'd stopped believing I'd ever have one." Tears filled Victoria's eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "I love you, Wade Lawson, with all my heart." "And I love you," he replied, drawing her into his embrace, "now and always." Their son, William Lawson, arrived on a clear October morning after a labor that was mercifully shorter than Lily's had been. He came into the world with a head full of dark hair and eyes as blue as his father's, squalling his displeasure at the cold air on his wet skin. Wade, who had paced the porch throughout Victoria's labor, was the first to hold him after the midwife and Victoria. His big hands trembled as he cradled the tiny form, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered cheeks. "Hello, son," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Welcome to the world." Lily was fascinated by her little brother, peering at him with solemn eyes as he nursed at Victoria's breast. "My baby," she declared, touching his cheek with a gentle finger. "That's right," Victoria agreed, smiling at her daughter's possessiveness. "Your baby brother. You'll help Mama take care of him, won't you?" Lily nodded importantly, her dark curls bouncing. "I help." The first snowfall came early that year, blanketing the ranch in pristine white just as November began. Victoria stood at the window, William sleeping in her arms, watching Wade and Lily building a snowman in the yard. Lily's delighted laughter carried through the glass as Wade lifted her to place a carrot nose on their creation. Martha joined her at the window, her eyes warm as she watched the scene. "You've brought such life to this place," the older woman said. "To Wade especially. I worried about him for so long, thought he'd end up a lonely old bachelor like his uncle." Victoria smiled, adjusting William as he stirred in his sleep. "He saved me," she said softly. "When I had nothing, he gave me everything." Martha shook her head. "You saved each other," she corrected. "That's what love does when it's real." Christmas that year was a joyous affair. The house was decorated with evergreen boughs and paper chains that Lily had helped create. Wade had ridden to the nearest town and returned with presents for everyone: a doll for Lily, a silver rattle for William, a beautiful shawl for Victoria, and a new rocking chair for Martha to ease her arthritic joints. Victoria had spent weeks secretly sewing a quilt for Wade, piecing together scraps of fabric that held meaning for their family, a bit of Lily's first dress, A square from the shirt Wade had worn on their wedding day, a patch from the blanket that had first wrapped William. When Wade unwrapped it on Christmas morning, his eyes grew suspiciously bright. "This is," he began, running his hand over the careful stitches. "Our story," Victoria finished for him. "The story of our family." He looked up at her, love shining in his eyes. "The best story I know." Later, after the children were in bed and Martha had retired for the night, Victoria and Wade sat together before the dying fire, sharing a glass of whiskey and the comfortable silence of deep companionship. "I've been thinking," Wade said eventually, "about expanding the ranch come spring. The Peterson place to the north is for sale. It would nearly double our grazing land." Victoria considered this. "Can we afford it?" Wade nodded. "The cattle sales were good this year, and I've been saving. With the extra land, we could increase the herd substantially." "For the children," Victoria said, understanding his motivation. "To give them a secure future." "Yes," Wade agreed. "For Lily and William, and any others that might come along," he added with a meaningful glance. Victoria laughed, leaning against his solid warmth. "Let me recover from William first, if you please." Wade chuckled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "No rush," he assured her. "We have all the time in the world." As they prepared for bed that night, Victoria paused at the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. The snow-covered plains stretched away toward distant mountains, peaceful and pure in the silvery light. This land that had once seemed so harsh and unwelcoming now felt like home in a way no other place ever had. Wade came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Lawson?" Victoria smiled at the name she still hadn't tired of hearing. "I was thinking about journeys," she said. "About how the most difficult paths sometimes lead to the most beautiful destinations." Wade turned her in his arms, his expression serious as he gazed down at her. "When you rode onto this ranch, you looked half dead from exhaustion and fear. I remember thinking I'd never seen anyone so beautiful or so sad." Victoria touched his face, tracing the lines that sun and wind had etched around his eyes. "And I remember thinking you were the kindest man I'd ever met, offering shelter to a woman you didn't know." "I think I loved you even then," Wade admitted, "though I didn't recognize it for what it was." "When did you know?" Victoria asked curiously. Wade thought for a moment. "The night Lily was born," he said finally. "When I saw you holding her, looking so tired but so fierce and protective. I knew then I wanted to protect you both for the rest of my life." Victoria's heart swelled with love for this man who had accepted not only her but her child as his own without hesitation or reservation. "And you?" Wade asked. "When did you know?" "The first time I saw you with Lily," she replied without hesitation. "You held her so carefully, looked at her with such wonder, as if she were a miracle instead of a burden or a shame. That's when I knew." Wade drew her closer, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of deep and abiding love. Victoria responded eagerly, her body warming to his familiar touch despite the many times they had come together. Later, as they lay in the darkness of their bedroom, Victoria rested her head on Wade's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His arms encircled her, strong and secure, a haven she had never expected to find. "I love you, Victoria Lawson," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "And I love you," she whispered back. "Always." Spring returned to the Broken Spoke Ranch, bringing with it new life and fresh beginnings. The addition to the house was completed, giving the growing family more room to spread out. Wade purchased the neighboring property as planned, and the sound of hammering filled the air as he and his hired hands built new corrals and extended the barn. Victoria planted a garden larger than the previous years. With Lily, helping by digging small holes and dropping in seeds under her mother's guidance. William, now 6 months old, watched from a blanket spread nearby, chewing contentedly on a wooden rattle and occasionally rolling over to investigate an interesting insect or blade of grass. Martha had decided to visit her sister in Colorado for the summer, leaving Victoria in full charge of the household. Though the responsibility was sometimes overwhelming, Victoria found she enjoyed being mistress of her domain, organizing the home to suit their family's needs and planning improvements for the future. One warm afternoon, as Victoria sat on the porch nursing William, she spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon riders approaching from the direction of town. She watched curiously as they drew closer, eventually making out Wade at the head of the small group. She stood as they reached the yard, William cradled against her shoulder. Wade dismounted and came to meet her, his face alight with excitement. "Victoria," he called, taking the porch steps 2 at a time, "you'll never guess what happened in town." Before she could respond, he swept her and William into a gentle embrace, mindful of the baby between them. "What is it?" she asked, laughing at his enthusiasm. Wade released her, turning to gesture at the men who had accompanied him. "These gentlemen are from the territorial governor's office. They're surveying for the new railroad spur line." Victoria's eyes widened. They'd heard rumors about the railroad extending a line through their area, but nothing had been confirmed until now. "And," she prompted, sensing there was more to the story, Wade's grin widened. "And they want to put a station on our land, the new section we bought from Peterson. They're willing to pay a fair price for the acreage they need." Victoria gasped, understanding immediately what this could mean for their future. A railroad station would bring more people to the area, increase the value of their remaining land, and make it much easier to get their cattle to market. "That's wonderful news," she said, shifting William to her other shoulder as he began to fuss. Wade nodded, then turned to introduce her to his companions. The men tipped their hats respectfully, and the oldest among them, who introduced himself as Mr. Harrington, complimented Victoria on her fine family and beautiful home. After Victoria had arranged refreshments for their guests and settled William in his cradle for a nap, the men spread maps across the dining table and began discussing the proposed location for the station and the compensation the railroad company was offering. "It's a generous sum," Wade told her later, after the visitors had departed with promises to return the following week with formal papers. "Enough to build a proper house if you'd like. Something bigger, with real glass windows and maybe even indoor plumbing." Victoria considered this as she prepared supper, Lily helping by arranging biscuits on a baking sheet with intense concentration. "I don't know," she said thoughtfully. "I've grown fond of this house. It's where we became a family." Wade came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. "We can stay here if that's what you want. Use the money to improve what we have instead of starting over." Victoria leaned back against him, grateful as always for his understanding. "Perhaps a little of both, some improvements here and save the rest for the children's education." Wade kissed her neck, sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. "As always, Mrs. Lawson, your wisdom prevails." The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their growing children. Lily started school in the one-room schoolhouse that had been built near the railroad station, returning each day bursting with new knowledge and ideas. William grew into a sturdy boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's gentle heart. The Broken Spoke Ranch prospered along with the small community that sprang up around the railroad station. Wade added to their holdings when possible, always with an eye toward the legacy he was building for his children. Victoria managed the household with quiet efficiency. finding time between her duties to continue her sewing no longer out of necessity, but for the joy of creation. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Wade surprised Victoria with a trip to San Francisco, a journey made possible by the railroad that now connected their once isolated ranch to the wider world. They left the children in Martha's capable care and traveled west, marveling together at the mountains and deserts they passed through, and finally at the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Standing on the shore, watching the waves crash against the sand, Victoria felt a sense of completion she had never expected to experience. From the frightened, desperate young woman who had fled Santa Fe 6 years earlier, she had transformed into a confident wife and mother, respected in her community and secure in her husband's love. "What are you thinking?" Wade asked, standing beside her as they watched the sunset turn the water to molten gold. Victoria smiled, linking her arm through his. "I was thinking about fate and second chances, about how the darkest moments of our lives can lead to the brightest." Wade nodded, understanding as he always did. "If you hadn't been carrying Lily, you might never have left Santa Fe. And I might never have found you," Victoria finished. "Sometimes I wonder if I should thank Richard for his cowardice." Wade snorted, shaking his head. "I prefer to thank God for guiding you to my door." Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder, watching as the last sliver of sun disappeared beneath the horizon. "As do I." They returned home refreshed and renewed, greeted by their children's enthusiastic embraces and Martha's knowing smile. Life resumed its familiar rhythm, but with a deeper appreciation for the blessings they shared. 2 years later, Victoria gave birth to their 3rd child, a daughter they named Grace, who arrived with her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes. Lily, now 9, appointed herself the baby's primary caretaker, reading stories to her infant sister and helping with diaper changes with surprising competence. William, at 6, was less interested in the baby but fiercely protective whenever strangers came to visit. As Victoria watched her family grow and flourish, she sometimes thought back to that desperate night on the trail when she had wept bitter tears, believing no man would ever want her. How wrong she had been. Wade had not only wanted her but had cherished her, scars and all, building with her a life richer and more fulfilling than she had ever dared to dream. On a warm summer evening, as their 10th anniversary approached, Victoria found Wade sitting on the porch of the house they had gradually improved over the years, but never replaced. The children were asleep, the day's work was done, and a peaceful quiet had settled over the ranch. She sat beside him on the swing he had built when she was pregnant with William, resting her head against his shoulder in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Happy?" he asked, his arm coming around her in a familiar embrace. Victoria smiled, thinking of their 3 beautiful children, the prosperous ranch, the community they had helped build, and most of all, the love that had grown stronger with each passing year. "Completely," she answered, turning her face up for his kiss. "More than I ever believed possible." Wade's lips met hers with the tenderness that still made her heart race after all their years together. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, his eyes holding the same wonder they had shown the first time he'd held Lily. "I thank God every day that you found your way to me," he murmured. "You and Lily were the greatest gifts I never knew to ask for." Victoria closed her eyes, savoring the moment and the man who had healed her broken heart and shown her that true love sees beyond flaws and circumstances to the person within. "And you," she whispered, "were the answer to a prayer I was afraid to voice." Together they sat in the gathering darkness, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast sky above their home, their hands intertwined and their hearts beating as two souls who had found in each other the healing, acceptance, and love they had both been seeking, though neither had known it until fate brought them together on a desperate night when hope seemed lost. In the years that followed, the story of Victoria and Wade Lawson became something of a legend in the small community that grew around the railroad station. People spoke of the brave young woman who had arrived alone and with child, and of the rancher who had seen not her shame but her strength. They told of how he had kissed her belly when she wept that no man would want her, and whispered that he already did. It was a story of second chances and redemption, of family created through choice rather than blood, and of love that saw beyond circumstance to the truth of the heart. It was, in the end, a story of hope that even in the darkest moments, light can be found if one has the courage to seek it. And for Victoria and Wade Lawson, that hope became the foundation of a life built on love, respect, and the daily choice to see the best in each other, a choice that carried them through trials and triumphs alike, binding them together until the end of their days.